And thank you for inviting me to be part of this lecture series. It's quite an honor to do the Faulkner lecture series lectures. And so, as Sarah said, I am at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. It's a federally funded research and development center that's primarily funded by the National Science Foundation. So I talked about, hey, I'm going to give up on this right away. I talked about the role that clouds play on atmospheric composition, and you say, well, but isn't the composition of the air nitrogen and oxygen, and we're all good? And maybe I have to give up on this.
Context. I think it's just. Now try.
Perfect. Okay, so right, completely right, right? Mostly nitrogen and oxygen. What I'm really going to talk about is what you see here is on how clouds affect trace gases, which are marked in this red sliver, this very tiny little portion of the atmospheric composition, and aerosols, which I think you could group into that. So I'm going to tell you first, what do I mean by trace gases? Trace gases are not actually listed in that first graph, right? But they include things like water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. These are all things that you know about, right? Water vapor makes clouds and precipitation. Carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases. Ozone is a pollutant at the Earth's surface, and so we really have a lot of interest in ozone. And then there are a number of other trace gases. Actually, there are tens or thousands of compounds out there in the atmosphere that we're still learning about. Many of these I have labeled as VOC, or volatile organic compounds. And if any of you, I'm not sure you have to do this in the Whiteface Mountain area, but if you ever have your emissions checked on your car, they look for things like volatile organic compounds because of their potential to make ozone. And I'll explain that to you in just a minute. But before I go there, I want to mention, what is an aerosol? And here's the definition of an aerosol. And really what I'm getting to are particles in the air. And those could be dust particles, they could be soot particles, sea salt. They can be even smaller, like the sulfate aerosols. And, there's just a whole variety of particles in the atmosphere. Why do we care about trace gases and aerosols? I've hinted at it. They impact our air quality. Ozone and aerosols cause upper respiratory ailments. They worsen asthma and cardiovascular disease. Also, ozone damages vegetation and reduces crop yields. And so that's an economic issue. Aerosols and trace gases also affect climate. We know that aerosols actually reflect, but black carbon or soot will absorb radiation, and so that heats the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases, as you know, trap heat in the atmosphere. I want to take a step further and talk a little bit more about ozone, because it's such a fun molecule and has its many personalities. I'm guessing, have heard of the ozone layer, which is in the stratosphere, so tens of miles above us. But it plays a huge role in the stratosphere because it absorbs UV radiation and protects the Earth's surface from that UV radiation. There's lots of ozone in the stratosphere, and that's where that ozone layer is. But near the surface of, so we really like ozone in the stratosphere. Near the surface, ozone is a pollutant. As I said, it damages ecosystems and impacts human health. There's another area I want to talk about too, and that's the upper troposphere. So right below that stratosphere. And in that region, ozone acts as a greenhouse gas as trapping heat. Okay, so how does ozone get into the upper troposphere? Well, one great possibility is from the stratosphere. So air doesn't sit still, it goes up and down as well as moving west to east, as Scott was just showing you earlier. And so air can come from the stratosphere into the troposphere. And for a long time, that's where we thought ozone was coming from, into the stratosphere, into the troposphere. But it turns out it can also be produced chemically. And in particular, it can be produced in the outflow of thunderstorms. And so I'm going to get to that somewhere in the middle of my talk. Let me tell you how that's made. There are three things that you need to make ozone, and that takes sunlight, nitrogen oxides, and hydrogen oxides. So these are listed here on the left. The nitrogen oxides is another trace gas that is looked for when you get your car emissions checked. And so it's something that we can control, as well as these volatile organic compounds. And the volatile organic compounds are making these hydrogen oxides, HOX, which is OH plus HO2. And I'm going to throw a bunch of chemistry at you. I'm sorry, I am partly a chemist as well as a meteorologist. But I just want you to remember, we emit things, volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides. They meet up and they do some chemistry and make ozone when you have sunshine. Okay, so I talked about in this title trace gases and aerosols, but I didn't talk about clouds. And you might have thought, well, that's a given. But I just want to make a little emphasis here, right? Clouds cover most of the Earth. And so this is a satellite picture from a week or so ago. We're showing how ubiquitous clouds are. And it's important to think about how those clouds are affecting the composition of the atmosphere around them. Clouds can be of many different types. Here are a couple of pictures of both stratus clouds and stratocumulus clouds, fair weather cumulus clouds, altocumulus clouds, so clouds a little bit higher in the atmosphere. Here's some tropical convection over the ocean. This one's a lenticular cloud. Do you have these here? So mountain wave clouds. This picture was taken in Washington State. And then thunderstorms. These are a couple pictures of severe thunderstorms. And so you might ask, so which clouds are important for atmospheric composition? And I'd say really all of these clouds are useful and important for atmospheric composition. There are a few that I didn't show here, but they, in their own way, they can also impact the atmospheric composition. Okay, so I want to now take you to how do clouds affect trace gases and aerosols? And I usually do this by talking about thunderstorms. And that's because thunderstorms are probably the most complicated cloud out there because they span from near the surface to the top of the troposphere, and they have a lot of things going on inside them. So let's just quickly step through. There's vertical transport. There's entrainment. Entrainment is mixing of clear air from the side into the cloud. There's wet deposition, which means it's removal of trace gases and aerosols by rain. There's production of nitrogen oxides by lightning going on. Aqueous-phase chemistry. There's cloud physics that's happening to create that rain and snow, ice and graupel and hail in these storms. And then there's scattering of sunlight, which changes how fast this chemistry is happening. So what I want you to take away from this is that there's not just a chemistry happening in clouds, but there's atmospheric transport and physics that affect the atmospheric composition. So I just want to step through this a little bit more. So if you were in our parcel, you run those trace gases or aerosols, this is what would happen as you would get ingested into a storm. Okay, so you'd be starting in at the bottom of the storm and getting pulled into the storm. And so you get these aerosols as seeds for the cloud drops. And so they right away become part of the cloud particles. At the same time, these trace gases are dissolving into the cloud drops, okay? And those cloud drops, as they are being produced, are growing and getting big enough to become rain. And so right away, the rain, we're moving things from being in the gas to precipitation and getting rained out. But if that air parcel travels further and makes it past that freezing level, you're now in an area where you have ice and snow, but also super cooled cloud drops. And those cloud drops get collected by the snow. And that snow becomes rimed. I think maybe you know about that here in terms of really wet grapple-like snow. Those cloud drops get collected by the grapple. That grapple can become bigger, become hail, and the cloud drops are collected by the hail. So as that air is moving up, it can the trace gases can dissolve in, get transferred over to precipitation and rained out. Some fraction goes that way, some fraction comes up. And we want to know, hey, how much is getting up to the upper troposphere and then affecting the ozone as it gets moved into the upper troposphere. So I'm going to talk about a couple of sets of constituents. I'm going to talk about formaldehyde and hydrogen peroxide. There's some volatile organic compounds that contribute to ozone production. And I'm going to talk about aerosols. I'm going to talk about sulfate aerosols, nitrate aerosols, ammonium aerosols, and organic aerosols. And I will talk about that using aircraft observations. And so I'm going to talk to you about a couple of field campaigns. One was the Deep Convective Clouds and Chemistry field campaign that took place in central US, and you can see the flight tracks in the lower left. And the other one's called the Seekers field campaign that took place a year later and sampled convection in the southeast US. And I'll talk, show some results from a few storms there. We used a few aircraft to do these field campaigns. In the first one, DC-3, we had 3 aircraft, the NSF NCAR Gulfstream and the NASA DC-8 aircraft. And also the German Aerospace Agency brought their Falcon aircraft to be part of this field campaign. And then during Seekers, we just had the NASA DC-8 field craft. Just to give you a feel for what it's like when you're on the aircraft and are taking samples, these are what you might see outside the window. And so you, upper left is a picture of the runway. You can see pictures of the clouds, but you also have times when you're actually working with another airplane and you want to make sure your measurement of the same thing is matching. So you fly next to each other in the same air mass to see what that was like. So that's some fun pictures from that. I also want to show you what it was like to go and do a flight during this DC-3 field campaign. So I'm using this as an example, the May 29th, 2012 DC-3 storm case. It was a severe storm that took place in northern Oklahoma. So you can see a storm start here. So what I'm going to show you in a movie will be some radar reflectivity. So something that Scott just showed you a few minutes ago in terms of where the rain is right now. So here's an example of the radar reflectivity at the start of this movie. And then up here is Salina, Kansas, where our aircraft were based. And you're going to see 2 aircraft leave this location and fly down into Oklahoma to sample the storm. So let's run through this movie and see how this works. See, there's no storm and they're flying, but now it shows up. They measure what's going into the storm. They measure what's coming out of the storm. And I'm going to see if I can actually run it again and stop it a little bit sooner to see, give you a sense of, hey, here's the storm. They sampled down here to see what air was going into the storm. They sampled up here. So now they are 10 kilometers higher and are sampling what's coming out of these storm cells flowing to the southeast. So that's how we put this campaign together to understand how thunderstorms affect atmospheric composition. So I'm going to move to some science, and I'm going to talk about vertical transport, entrainment, and wet deposition. And so this is how we analyzed it. Now that you know how the airplanes flew, we're going to make use of information from the inflow. We'll take the concentrations of the trace gases and the aerosols in the air that enter the storm. We'll make use of the measurements that the airplane sampled that was coming out of the storm. But we also want to we need to make use of this clear air vertical profile, because I mentioned entrainment and the air mixes in here. We need to know about that. So what we do is we do a calculation to estimate how much of this trace gas or aerosol would have made it to the cloud top if it were only transported and entrainment occurred. So how do we find entrainment? We make use of some of our chemical trace gases, in particular carbon monoxide or hydrocarbons like butane or pentane. They're all passive trace gases that are not reacting chemically very fast, and they're not soluble, so they're not going into the cloud particles. And so they can teach us, well, how much entrainment, how much clear air is getting into the cloud. And then we simply compare this calculation to what we measured, and we can estimate how much of that trace gas or aerosol was scavenged. Okay, I hope that makes sense, because now I'm just show you some answers. So we looked at, as I said, hydrogen peroxide that I show in the upper panel and formaldehyde in the lower panel. I'm showing you scavenging efficiencies on the left, and I'm plotting these results as a function of how strong that convection was. Some weak convection, too strong, and severe convection. The boxes are showing what we knew before we went out to DC3 and Seekers to get this information. And what we learned from our observations is that a lot of that hydrogen peroxide is getting removed and being rained out. And that it's mostly getting removed in that liquid only below that freezing level region. And we learned that by doing some modeling work. Formaldehyde is not removed nearly as much. About 50% of it is removed. And if you squint your eyes, it looks like maybe there's more removed in weak storms compared to strong storms. And we did notice that there's an effect of the ice physics, the cloud physics, on how much of the formaldehyde is removed or not. So that's two trace gases. Here's some aerosols. And what I'm showing here is the same thing with scavenging efficiencies on the left, weak convection to strong convection on the bottom. And I'm going to show you results for sulfate, ammonium, and nitrate. These are all water-friendly aerosols, and so we expect them to be removed. And then I'm going to show you results for organic aerosols, which is not quite as water-friendly. So we don't expect as high of a scavenging efficiency. What we learned is that these sulfate, ammonium, and organic aerosols had very high scavenging efficiencies, especially in the severe storms. Nitrate aerosols threw us for a loop. I found moderate scavenging efficiencies. I also had fewer answers. And why is that? And it turned out that our measurements in the convective outflow were sometimes higher than the measurements that were in the boundary layer. Something totally unexpected when you have most of the concentration of these trace gases and aerosols right next to the Earth's surface. And so you might ask, well, why is that? And one reason is lightning. It produces nitric oxides, which then can maybe make nitrate aerosol. Another reason is that we noticed that there was some air that had a mid-troposphere aerosol nitrate layer. And let me show what I mean there. So I'm showing some clear air profiles of these aerosol concentrations. And I'm showing them for 4 storms. And the two on the left are showing this peak in the middle of the troposphere for aerosol nitrate. We don't see that for aerosol sulfate or ammonium. We don't see that for these Oklahoma storms on the right. So they're happening in Northeast Colorado, Southwest Nebraska, but not in Oklahoma. We ran some back trajectories from those particular storms that were showing that mid-troposphere aerosol peak. And we can point to Arizona and northern Mexico as possibly the source of that elevated aerosol peak. So basically that air is starting near the ground in Arizona. It's getting lofted to go up and over the mountains, and then ends up at about 4 or 5 kilometers above this above sea level in the mid-troposphere. Okay, so I did one more calculation and I said, well, what if our clear air profile did not have that peak? Would we have the scavenging that we expected for a nitrate aerosol? And it does increase the amount of scavenging if you don't have that peak. But it wasn't enough to explain the low to say, okay, we have moderate scavenging efficiencies of aerosol nitrate only because of this elevated aerosol layer. So the other explanation is lightning. This is the chemistry that happens. So NO forms NO2, NO2 oxidizes to form nitric acid, and nitric acid likes to go on to aerosols. And so it will move on to the aerosols. So if I go and I do a calculation to figure out how much nitric acid the lightning source might be making, it comes out to be 50 to 100 parts per trillion of nitric acid, which is more than enough to explain why we don't see as high of a scavenging efficiency of aerosol nitrate as we did for aerosol sulfate. So that's just to take you back to my little schematic that asked at the beginning, hey, what's the fraction that we're removing of these ozone precursors and aerosols? And so the takeaway is that we do remove a lot of these soluble trace gases and aerosols for the most part, but there is some fraction that makes it up to the upper troposphere. Nitrogen oxides and the volatile organic compounds will go on and make some ozone. And I wanted to show you some results there. So remember, sunshine plus nitric oxides plus hydrogen oxides will make ozone. We can do that calculation with our chemistry models, but we also had the good fortune to be able to do some aircraft measurements in convective outflow from early in the morning until late in the afternoon. And that's what I'm showing here is the flight track going back and forth through some convective outflow for this time period and measuring all sorts of what concentrations of the trace gases and looking at how their concentrations evolved during that time period. So at 7 a.m., the ozone was only 55 parts per billion, and by the 5 p.m. it was 70 parts per billion. So that's a lot of ozone that's being made. And this is also in agreement with what we were estimating before with modeling studies, anywhere from 5 to 20 parts per billion per day of ozone being produced, especially right after it exits the convective storm. That does have an impact on the atmospheric radiation, and so it can affect climate. We made an estimate, or not we, my colleagues made an estimate of somewhere about a 0.5 watt per meter squared, which is a substantial amount. But something to remember is that this is a regional phenomenon, and it's not year-long, it's a short-lived phenomenon. Okay, so those are some results from the aircraft sampling. Aircraft sampling is great for understanding how clouds affect the atmospheric composition. They're great because you can take yourself in your chemistry lab to the cloud, but they're also expensive. Not just the cost of running the aircraft, but also the time it takes to do it, the logistics. And it turns out that your sampling time can actually be quite short for the information you want. So some of those storms, we had maybe 5 minutes of information of air coming out of the storm. Some of those storms, we had 30 seconds, and that's the data that we had to use. So your instrument had to be working very fast to get that data. Alternatively, there's the mountaintop observatories like Whiteface Mountain. In contrast to going to the cloud, you have to wait for the cloud to come to the observatory. I think it's less expensive than aircraft campaigns, but Sarah can tell us more. And you get much longer sampling times, but maybe less information on the overall picture of the all the different trace gases that are affecting what you measure. But I do find that they're great for studying the actual chemistry that's going on inside those cloud drops. And so that's where I want to take you. There are a number of mountaintop sites around the world. I'm only showing 4 of them in this picture. Sarah and I were talking about another one in Europe earlier today. There are definitely more, but what I really want to point out is that they're great natural flow through reactors. And this was shown in the 1990s at Great Dunfell in the United Kingdom, where you can see how the air flows up one side of the mountain. You could take measurements at points along that mountain. And then you're in cloud at the top, and you can take measurements of what's going on inside the cloud there. And then the air flows down the other side. And if you're lucky to have that, to be able to put a station there, you can see what is the effect of that cloud on and that cloud chemistry through this natural flow through reactor. Okay, that's what I wanted to say there. So what we've learned over the years, I'm showing here. So back in the 1990s, we were very concerned about sulfur and its production of sulfate. We learned a lot about that even earlier in the 1970s and 1980s because of its sulfate's impact on acid rain. And that's what made Whiteface Mountain a really great site because it unfortunately became a receptor of the industrial pollution from the Midwest, and sulfate and acid rain was something to address in this region. Besides sulfate and nitrate, there has been more recent studies looking at how the aqueous phase is enriching the organic chemistry and creating organic acids. And so that's been looked at in Germany as well as Mount Tai, China. But also Sarah and her group has been doing some of this through this chemical processing of organics within clouds. So now I have to give you a chemistry lesson. I hope it's okay. You're probably saying, I've had enough chemistry already. First, I want to tell you what I think cloud chemistry is. It's very easy to say cloud chemistry is aqueous phase chemistry, but I think it's more than that. It also, to me, it also includes changing the gas chemistry because some trace gas ran off and went into the cloud drop and it's not doing its chemical reactions in the gas phase anymore. And so there's this, what I call separation of species that happens. And then there's also remembering the sunlight and how it's brighter in some parts of the cloud and darker in others. And that affects, that sunshine is so important to making the chemistry happen. So it's going to be slower where it's dark, and it's going to be faster where it's bright. Here in the schematic, I'm focused on how do we get and make organic acids inside a cloud drop. And so what we need is an aldehyde, and we need an oxidant, and that's called the hydroxyl radical. We actually call hydroxyl radical the Pac-Man of the atmosphere because it goes around and reacts with all sorts of trace gases. It's very reactive. So that aldehyde dissolves in, OH dissolves in, and they react together. They make a carboxylic acid, which can keep reacting and make dicarboxylic acids and other carboxylic acids. So these acids are what we're after and trying to understand. And you're like, huh, what are those? Carboxylic acids include compounds like formic acid, acetic acid, which you all know as vinegar, glycolic acid, glyxylic acid, pyruvic acid. And then oxalic acid I made purple because it's special. It has two carboxylic acids. So that's the dicarboxylic acid that we really pay attention to. We'd like to show our chemical formulas, and really what I want to point out, they all have the same COOH functional group. And you can see that in every single one of them, and two of them with oxalic acid. We care about oxalic acid because it's really likes being in the water and in the particle phase. And so once it's formed, it's pretty much going to be part of organic aerosols from there on out, once like those cloud drops evaporate. So it's adding mass to the aerosol concentration. I need to talk about one more thing. And here I'm sorry to get into a little bit more math, but when you do this dissolution, it's actually a two-way street. So it goes, this aldehyde will go both in and out. This is governed by something that's called the Henry's law. And we collect data about what this equilibrium constant is between the two gas and aqueous phases. We also have a thing that's called dissociation. And so an acid like formic acid will actually break apart and form a formate, anion and hydrogen ion. And so we collect information on what those rate constants or equilibrium constants are. Here I'm calling it K1. And the reason I'm telling you about this is that we get values for these rate constants in the laboratory, and that's placed in a chemical database. I'm telling you about this because one lab experiment might say it's one value, another lab experiment might say it's another value. There's no recommended value for aqueous phase chemistry. Also, it's really important to say that these values vary due to temperature. And I don't have an example here, but what it's important to realize is that the colder it gets, the more the trace gas wants to go into the droplet. And actually, you might notice that if you ever open a bottle of Coke that has carbonic acid in it, and if it's warm, there's more coming out than if it's cold. Right? It's more bubbly when you drink it when it's cold. Okay, so let's the background. We got started on this 8 years ago. In 2016, a group of us came to Whiteface Mountain to talk about cloud chemistry measurements and modeling. We wanted to figure out, hey, how can we better understand this organic aqueous phase chemistry at our mountaintop observatories like Whiteface Mountain. So you can see the group of us at the summit. That's only half of us, it turns out. The other half went earlier in the day. One of the outcomes of this workshop was to assess the state of knowledge of cloud chemistry through a box model and a comparison. And so this box model in a comparison compared 5 cloud chemistry box models and did it by making use of the conditions on the 16th of September, 2016, which actually was the last day or the day after that workshop. And we ran our simulations at a fixed point at the top of Whiteface Mountain for a 20-hour cloud encounter. And there it is. So you might be wondering, hey, what's a chemistry box model? It's just an imaginary box where we're representing the chemistry that's going on, both gas phase and aqueous phase chemistry. So the chemistry in the cloud drops and the chemistry in the air between the cloud drops. We need to have input information. So we give it temperature, pressure, liquid water content, which we get from the Whiteface Mountain measurements, start and stop times. We have initial concentrations, things like water vapor, ozone, carbon monoxide, and a whole slew of other trace gases. And then we get out the concentrations during that 20-hour time period. Something to remember that was once famously said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So take this, everything I show you with a grain of salt. Okay, and I wanted to mention again that we have 5 models. What I want you to know is that some models have a lot of chemistry in them. They're very detailed. They're going to be our best models that are out there. And some are simpler models. They don't have nearly as much chemistry. I'm one of those. And the reason I do that is because I want to be able to take what I learned from these highly complex models and put it into our global models, our air quality models, to try to predict not just the chemistry, but also the transport and other processes going on in the atmosphere. Okay, this is what we learned. I'm showing you organic acid concentrations on the left axis as a function of time. These are aqueous phase organic acid concentrations. So just what's the concentration in the cloud water? In gray is nighttime. The cloud started a little bit before nighttime, that's marked here, and lasted all through the night and a good 12 hours or so during the day the next day. And the other thing I want you to notice is that the left axes all are on log scales. So every time you see one of these tick marks, it's 10 times more. And so when you see differences between these lines, it means that there's a lot of variation. And so we do see a lot of variation. And we tracked that down and we learned 2 things. One was that our main oxidant, OH, varied a lot among the models. And that was attributed to the chemistry that was represented in the models being different. And so that's a matter of, hey, do we understand the chemistry well enough? And apparently we don't, for sure. But the other one was what I was talking about, was the chemical database. We're using different Henry's law and dissociation constants. And I did a run where I used the same chemistry, but different Henry's law and dissociation constants. And I could see which of these molecules were affected by that chemical database. And it mattered. And so I'm pushing to try to get recommendations, because I'm just a modeler. I don't know which one to use. And I need an expert laboratory person to tell me which was the best measurement to use. Other things to notice in these plots is that we have organic acids being formed, especially during the first few hours of the simulation. And then during the daytime of the second day, many of these organic acids reached some peak value and then started decreasing. And that's because I said in that earlier schematic that they go on and keep reacting. And so they reached their peak kind of steady state value and then started depleting afterwards. So this is explaining what we learned. Again, this chemical data and different chemistry explained that we have our state of knowledge is really quite uncertain. I guess I also want to underscore that, hey, we're just starting. We're starting to learn a lot about organic aqueous chemistry, and we have a long ways to go. And so these are just guidelines of, hey, what are things that we can start doing better? But I also want to point out that what I put in yellow here. These simulations for a fixed point at with a 20-hour cloud encounter, and that's not quite right. And in fact, air parcels don't spend that much time in cloud. And here's an example where someone did some calculations and estimated on average about 15 minutes in time, but anywhere from 5 to 45 minutes, air parcels are in contact. So I swore that the next time I did this, I was going to do more of what we call Lagrangian, a trajectory analysis. And so that takes me to my next topic, which is looking at organic acids, is working with Sarah and her student Chris Lawrence to look at organic acids during a polluted event at Whiteface Mount in New York. And so Chris really led and did all this work, and I'm just the reporter. This polluted event was in July 1st and 2nd of 2018. It was associated with a heat wave, which you can see by these temperatures over here on the left, and had high particulate matter, which you see on the lower right, where I'm showing both a model, a regional air quality model prediction, and measurements from the EPA showing high concentrations in New England. Chris did some back trajectories to see where the air is coming from. He found they were coming from central Missouri, where there are a lot of trees. And in Missouri, there's a lot of trees in Missouri, and that meant there are a lot of isoprene mixing ratios. And you're like, okay. And the isoprene is being emitted by trees, particularly oak trees, but any broadleaf tree. It's one of our most abundant volatile organic compounds in the atmosphere. And it plays an active role in the chemistry, and it makes both ozone and organic acids, organic aerosols. We took an air quality model, or a regional model. It's called the Weather Research and Forecasting Model, coupled with chemistry. This model we fondly called WRF. It's actually used by both researchers and weather forecasters, and weather forecast offices across the world for weather prediction. And WRF Chem is used for air quality forecasting to better understand, and also to better understand processes that affect the atmospheric composition. It's a regional scale model, and here we applied it to the conterminous US and part of Canada for our simulations. In this model, we launched some trajectories from central Missouri, and hopefully they would go to Whiteface Mountain so we could understand what is happening in these air parcels going forward. I guess the one thing I didn't point out is that those air trajectories went right over Chicago, and they picked up some anthropogenic emissions. So once we had those trajectories, we ran a detailed cloud chemistry, or I'm sorry, detailed gas phase box model that ran along the trajectory path to understand the impact of gas phase chemistry. Gas phase chemistry cannot explain the organic acids that were concentrations that were measured at Whiteface Mountain. And so we also ran my gas and aqueous chemistry box model to see if the cloud chemistry could explain the organic acid concentrations that were measured at Whiteface Mountain. And so here are some of those results. So here, again, on the left axis is the organic acid concentration. On the bottom is time. And we're running the model for 3-hour time blocks. Red is showing formic acid, and blue is showing acetic acid. And what we find is that all these lines showing the model are much less than the observations that are shown by the dotted lines up above. And so not even the cloud chemistry can explain the amount of formic acid and acetic acid being measured. And in fact, formic acid is getting depleted for a fair bit of the time. Okay. And I also want to get to oxalic acid, and that's what's shown in purple. Again, the solid lines are the model results. You can see oxalic acid being produced, and it's actually fairly reasonable to the measured oxalic acid oxalate at Whiteface Mountain, so we seem to at least have some agreement for oxalic acid. But it really tells you that we're still learning, and we're still learning about the aqueous-phase chemistry, especially for producing organic acids. So what I told you about was the importance of, as the production of organic acids is sensitive to these chemical data, and actually our representation of the aqueous-phase chemistry that's going on. And we need to learn a lot more. And so I'm aiming that we should keep doing these model measurement comparisons in order to advance our knowledge. But we should also be testing other aqueous-phase chemistry that's not represented in the model that I have, and sensitivities to the input data. So that takes me to my last slide. Just really want to remind you about all the processes and how clouds can affect trace gases and aerosols in many different ways through vertical transport and wet deposition, and then through chemistry after that transport to form ozone. And then lastly, this aqueous phase chemistry that produces organic acids and contribute to organic aerosols. I again want to continue to push to learn more about the chemistry inside the cloud drops, but I also going to make I also want to again emphasize this model measurement comparisons as a way to really advance our knowledge. So you can't just do modeling, you can't just do measurements, you got to work together to advance the field. And with that, I really appreciate your attention. Thank you, and be happy to take questions.